being called a social justice warrior, being called a social justice witch. To me, it's a way of saying that I care about people other than myself. It sort of comes with a promise to always try to think about how things affect the people whose experiences are nothing like my own. Hey viewers, my name's Kara. I'm your host for Tuesdays here on The Pagan Perspective, and this week we're talking about justice. This week we are answering a couple different people's questions, so they will be in the description of this video as always, but they are as follows. From Soul Seeker: I'm wondering if and how your path supports socioeconomic justice and eco-justice. And then from Rebekah: in reading the book For Earth's Sake, I found the argument and perspective that the domination of nature and women go hand in hand in our patriarchal society. It submits as evidence pointing to this fact that we refer to nature in a feminist view as Mother Nature, Mother Earth, and through the now stopped practice of naming hurricanes after women. It supposes that we cannot fix one without fixing the other. Curious about your thoughts and beliefs about this idea and argument. I think I'll actually start with that second one. I did already respond to Rebekah initially months and months ago when this topic was first suggested, because I do talk to Rebekah through social media every so often. So I did already mention to Rebekah the fact that the reclaiming tradition, which I am part of, and which a lot of Starhawk's books are great resources for people about, the reclaiming tradition considers itself what is called eco-feminist, and basically that argument that Rebekah was reading about in the book For Earth's Sake, which I have not read, ecofeminism is basically that argument. It's the idea that the way we as a society treat the earth and the way that we as a society treat the idea of the feminine go hand in hand, and that they are connected, eco and feminist. So this is something that I've definitely heard about before, being part of reclaiming, having read a lot of resources about that type of thing. So the other thing that I'm actually finishing up reading right now, I'm literally on the last chapter finally. It's taken me a while to get through this one because I've been reading multiple books at a time, kind of all of 2019. I am finally on the last chapter of The Earth Path by Starhawk. The subtitle is Grounding Your Spirit in the Rhythms of Nature. And this book is very much focused on environmental justice, environmental science, and issues within this realm of like eco-justice. This is not the only book of Starhawk's that talks about that, far from it. I mean, I think there's a little bit of it in The Spiral Dance, but also in the novel The Fifth Sacred Thing. A lot of this subject matter is dealt with for sure. But this one specifically is more about the environmental science aspects of it, and I happen to be finishing up that book right now. So yeah, it is an idea that I am familiar with. I am learning more from other people that there have been others in the past who associate themselves with ecofeminism as a wider movement, who have been kind of problematic in the ways that they approach these subjects. And I don't know so much about the overall movement as a whole. I'm really familiar with it through the lens of witchcraft and how activist witches work with these concepts. So both of these questions this week, the one specifically about the eco-feminist type view, and then the other one just more generally asking about socioeconomic justice and eco-justice, the fact that these are even questions that are coming up now really, to me, says that these ideas of magical activism and magical resistance that we have already been seeing recently becoming more popular, more well-known through the publishing of different books and things like that. There's more of a demand for it out there, so there is now becoming more of a market for information about how to do these things, how to become part of these things, how we can incorporate activism into our magical paths, things like that. It's really telling me that these ideas are expanding and growing to an even wider audience. So you may have seen, if you watch my personal channel, which is CuteWitch772, that earlier this year I read a new book by David Salisbury called Witchcraft Activism. And it is a short book. It's specifically tips and tricks to begin incorporating these two things, right? The practice of magic and activism, and beginning to bring them together, and different ways that we can start to do that. It's not a how to be a witch book or anything like that. It's very specifically about if you are already an activist, here are some magical practices that you can start to bring in to support your work as an activist, or vice versa, if you are already a practitioner of magic, whatever other way you may identify yourself, if you are a person who practices magic and utilizes magical practice in any way, how to bring basic activist practices into your life. So whether you're coming at it already from an activist standpoint or already from a magical standpoint, it kind of gives you a start to bridging those two and bringing them together. So if you want to hear more about that book and what I thought about it, I have a video on my personal channel reviewing that book, sort of just giving you an idea of what it's about. And I will link that in the description of this video. I might also put it up in the end screen. Who knows? We'll see when we get to the end of the video. But yeah, so this is a subject that's becoming more widely known. Even Laura Tempest Zakharoff in her new book, Weave the Liminal, talks about magical activism a little bit, and other books certainly do as well. I also have a video on my personal channel about Weave the Liminal if you're curious about my thoughts on that book. I read those both earlier this year. I've done a lot of reading this year. But yeah, so these are subjects that are absolutely part of my spiritual path, part of my spiritual practice, part of my path as a witch. And I do not, as with anything, I do not consider myself an expert in any of these areas, but very much a willing and eager student of these types of things. I am learning. I am learning as I go, as I practice, as I bring things into my everyday life. I think that making small changes throughout our daily lives can absolutely make a difference. There is also, I'm going to put some articles in the description of this video as well, some links to articles for you about some of these general topics, because these are really big topics that I could not possibly put in one video if I wanted to, and I also recognize that I may not be the most appropriate person to talk about these issues because, as I said, I'm not an expert. I'm still just learning. So there are some articles that I will link for you in the description. One of them talks about making small changes to help with environmental concerns and things like that. But yeah, some areas of eco-justice that I have been learning a lot more about over really just the past few years. You know, these are things that as I was growing up and as I was beginning my path as a pagan and as a witch, I had no concept of these things because they didn't directly affect me or my little bubble of the world. And so they weren't things that I was taught about as a kid. And so a lot of these things I didn't start becoming aware of until college, and other things not even until after college, really until I started getting more involved with reclaiming, which makes activism and social justice a really big part of our magical tradition and the way that we do things, the way that we interact with the world around us, and other things just because of other people in my life, you know. So my partner was actually an environmental activist for a number of years and did that professionally, worked in nonprofit environmental activism. So I actually did ask them some questions about this week's topic to try to help me wrap my head around some of the terminology, which I'll get to in a second. But as far as eco-justice, you know, things that I've learned a lot about in the past few years, not even a lot, you know, I've learned a very little bit, and to me it seems like a lot because I never knew anything about it before. But this is really how much I know, right? Just the tip of the iceberg. I know very little in the grand scope of things, and that is both disheartening in some ways because it makes you think like, wow, you know, why don't I know all of this stuff? How has this information been left out of our general existence for so long? How do we allow ourselves to be so separated from each other that we have no idea what's going on with other groups of people? And then in other ways, it's like, if you're someone like me who loves to learn and is just eager to now that we know about it, it's like, okay, well, now I can really be part of this. Now I can really do whatever I can to support people who have been doing this work for decades, and no longer be blind to all of that effort that's going on. So it's both like there are positive and negative emotions with that, right? So anyway, environmental racism and environmental classism are things that I've been learning about, such as, a lot of big environmentally disastrous sort of situations, a lot of infrastructure that affects the environment negatively is placed in lower class areas and is placed in communities of color. So there are specific groups of people who are more negatively impacted by the negative environmental effects of various things, be it factories, factory farming, nuclear power, whatever, tons of different situations. They tend to be situated in areas where whoever's in charge thinks, oh, we'll put this over here in communities that no one cares about. And that's how the rest of us kind of go through most of our life not being aware of it if we're not closely enough connected to it. And so I think a big thing that we can do is just start to educate ourselves and then educate other people about these issues. The fact that I didn't know any of this stuff existed before a handful of years ago, and it's definitely existed for kind of ever, for decades and decades since the Industrial Revolution, is kind of crazy, right? So just educating ourselves can be a big thing. I had my notes up on the screen here and it just went to sleep on me. Yeah, so environmental racism and classism are things that I didn't know about before that I am aware of now. Making sure that we're aware of policies that affect the environment. And making small changes for a bigger impact. As I mentioned before, there will be an article about that in the description, but also acting locally. If there are things like that are issues in your local area, becoming aware of things that affect your local community and making sure that we are aware of policies, that we can vote for or against certain policies that will have effects on our environment, whether it's fracking. That's another big thing, that fracking tends to take hold in lower income communities because the people who need money are more likely to sign away their rights for their land to these companies. But that's really devastating for the environment. And then other people who are close to that are also affected by that person's decision to sign away the rights to their land, and so we have to think about the way that things that we're doing are affecting other people, and it might be acting locally isn't just being aware of local issues that you can vote about legislation or sign petitions or, whatever. Acting locally could also be talking to your neighbors about what they're spraying on their lawn, because if they're spraying chemicals that are detrimental for the environment or detrimental to human or non-human animal health, that can affect the other people in your neighborhood just because of one person's decision. The water runoff, when it rains, it carries those chemicals into everyone else's yard. And so if you're growing a garden a few houses down from people who are spraying really nasty chemicals on their lawn and you want to grow your food organically, guess what? Probably not organic, because that ground where your house is has been riddled with these chemicals for how many years, and that's why it takes a long time for land to be sort of recertified as organic or to become organic in the first place, or to become certified organic in the first place. There are a lot of issues because you may not be putting anything on your plants, but maybe one of your neighbors is. And so just lots of things like that. And Starhawk talks about stuff like that in this book. Yeah, so I'm not going to get too much further into that. So that's kind of a little bit about eco-justice and how I think of it in terms of my path. I do garden and things like that, and I consider myself to be an earth-based practitioner. My path is nature-based. So issues that affect nature, that affect the environment, I think are very important to my spiritual path as well. I don't separate those things because it's all part of the same thing. And then the socioeconomic justice aspect, this is where I kind of had to ask my partner for a little bit of help, because we talk about social justice and I'm like, yeah, I know what that is. But then this word socioeconomic justice, I looked at this and I was like, wait, do I know what that is? And so I just kind of had to look up different things online, and there'll be links in the description as well, to try to wrap my head around it. And then I just ended up asking my partner too, because I was like, I know this, but for some reason the terminology is really tripping me up. Like, what is socioeconomic justice as different from these other types of things? Like, just help me remember, like, what constitutes socioeconomic versus different types of justice, right? Because there's all different types of justice and injustice issues. And so basically they helped me remember that, like, the social justice aspect is justice in terms of things that affect society, right? It's social, it's groups of people, not how things influence individuals, not how something influences me, but how something influences whole groups of people, whole social groups, or all of society, even on a larger scale. And then the economic part, of course, is the stuff that's directly related to money and distribution of wealth, distribution of income, things like that is under economic justice. So socioeconomic justice is things that affect groups within society that are specifically based on economic issues. So my partner helped me sort of make this list. So we talked about, and my partner is also a librarian and works in a low-income area with people with various needs in their community. And so a lot of these things I have more hands-on experience with through going to the library, meeting the people who actually live in these communities, seeing how things affect them, and just like becoming more aware of library policies, library programs, things that are offered to the public through the public library system that are really beneficial. And that, like, so you always hear me recommending, like, support your local public libraries because they really do provide a lot of different services as well. And it might not seem like it depending on where you are, because like where I used to live, the libraries were in more kind of well-to-do areas, and the libraries were just like a place where people would go and rent, not rent, but go and borrow DVDs. But then you go into other neighborhoods, other communities, and they really do need other services from the library, such as like access to internet is a thing that not everyone has at home. And so my partner generally mentioned access to information. And that might mean specifically access to the internet, because not everybody has internet at home, but it also can just mean literacy. Literacy is an issue in some communities. And so having other ways to access information is important for people. And that might be something that they get at the library, or me then taking this and translating it into how does this affect me, or how do I specifically incorporate these issues into my path as a pagan, as a witch. To me, that speaks to things like offering classes locally, in person, because not everybody has internet at home, so not everybody can take an online course to learn the basics of witchcraft, or not everybody can access books online because maybe they don't have the internet, or where literacy is a barrier to accessibility, books may not be enough. And so videos can be really helpful in that regard. But again, these videos are online, so videos help with literacy barriers, but may not help with the internet accessibility barriers, although audiobooks are also a thing. So it comes back to having classes in person can be really helpful, because people can then come face to face, learn from people, ask questions, rather than just being given a book or a pamphlet or something to read, which might be a barrier for some people. And then along with local classes, the question comes up of transportation. Transportation is a big accessibility issue in some areas and for some people, depending on their economic status or depending on location, or both. I heard from someone who lives in a somewhat major city, like last year, I think, sometime within the past year, who told me that there are local pagan events and classes and things like that in their area, but that they cannot attend them because they don't have their own transportation. So they do take public transportation, but the place where these classes or gatherings are held is not near any public transportation line. It's not near a bus stop, and so they cannot reasonably or feasibly get there even through public transport. So that's something that I had never thought of before, because I grew up in an area that was very rural, and so there was no public transportation. Everything is like forever apart, like we had to drive 20 minutes to get to the grocery store, kind of thing. So kind of everyone has a car, and if we don't, we carpool with friends, sure, like if you have one of your group of friends has a car, then you all can go places. But other than that, that's really how we had to get around. And so I grew up with like everybody has transportation of some kind, whether your mom's driving you or whatever, like you can get around because we had to have that or we couldn't get anywhere. So not having lived in a big city really until more recently, not having a lot of experience with public transportation, that's not something I had ever thought about before. Like if there are events and classes, but they're nowhere near a bus stop, so that brings up questions of like, can you have someone, if your group is organizing local classes and events, can you have some people who are either dedicated to doing the job or that will rotate doing the job of going to whatever that nearest bus stop is, or a couple nearby bus stops, and shuttle people in the rest of the way? These are things that I had never thought of before hearing from this person. And so it's very easy for me to see that a lot of other people maybe hadn't thought of that either. If we have our own transportation, we may not be thinking about people who don't. And so that's where like intersectionality comes in. That's where paying attention to the ways that groups of people who are not exactly like us are affected. That's where paying attention to those things really comes in. So access to information, transportation, internet access, literacy, all of these types of things, access to pagan spaces for gathering, for community, for learning. So if there are no events or classes in your area being held, then what do people do if they also don't have access to the internet? A lot of us have community here on the internet. If you're here watching this, you have access to the internet in some way, shape, or form. Whether you're at the library watching this or whatever, if you're away at school and you only have internet access when you're at school but you don't at home, whatever the case may be, if you're watching this right now, very likely you have internet access. There have been people in the past actually who have asked me if they can download some of my videos from my personal channel to bring them to their local community where they do gather in person, and sort of like play it off of a disc so that people can watch them and learn from them while not being connected to the internet. So that's something that I also never would have thought of because I was not in the position of working with an in-person local community, whereas these other people out there, hello to those of you out there who are organizers and teachers for local community, you think about things like that. Like, how do I bring these resources that are online to people who don't have the internet access? So it's very much about knowing your individual community and knowing your individual community's needs. Because if you are part of a community that all has internet access and you all have your own car, then what you need from the general pagan community is very different than the people who don't have those things, so what you need offered is very different. So if there are no pagan spaces for gathering, for community, for classes, whatever, someone in that area has to be the one to decide that they can make that happen, and that's a big undertaking. So anyone out there who's done that, and again, we're all not perfect, and there's definitely a learning curve with things like that. There are people who specifically what they do is go into different communities and help those communities grow, because it can be very difficult to do that from square one, And so, I've been very grateful to the other reclaiming communities nearby who have been helping my partner and I kind of try to figure out how do we grow reclaiming-based community in my area where right now there is none. And right now we have to drive 2.5 to 3 hours to the nearest city where there is an active reclaiming community in order to be in that kind of community. And we talked about there's a Christian church on every corner pretty much in the United States, which is where I'm from, if you couldn't already tell or didn't already know. And that's not the case with paganism and witchcraft communities, because we are still minority. We are still a minority religion. And so we don't have a pagan temple on every corner. So how do people in low-income areas, maybe who lack transportation, maybe who lack internet access, how do they find pagan community if that's what they're looking for? Or if, how would you know that it was even an option for you if you had never been exposed to it in some way, shape, or form? Like if all you're exposed to is one religion on every corner, that's what's easily available. What do you do? So I think it is really beneficial when people decide to show up in areas that don't already have a presence of paganism or whatever, just as an option for people who want that to be there, I know I get really frustrated with people who say there's nothing here, there's nothing in my town, and then I'll look it up and I'll be like, well, there's something an hour away from you, and we're not Christianity. We can't expect there to be a pagan temple on every corner. That's just not how it is at this point in time. We may have to reach a little bit farther to find community or to be part of something. But then, of course, it's important to remember accessibility. As I've been saying, not everyone has transportation to be able to travel an hour. And so there's got to be a balance there somewhere. It's not currently possible for us to be on every corner and in every community to the extent that some people need or want us to be. So whatever we can do, I think, helps with these areas, hosting in-person classes where people can come and get hands-on experience, have discussion face-to-face, ask questions, supporting public services like the library. As I mentioned before, the library also has a lot of classes that are beneficial for people in general. They have classes about basic computer skills. So people who previously had no idea how to use the internet might actually be able to learn how to search for things and how to visit websites and stuff like that. And obviously all the people watching this, most of you at least, are probably internet people. So you might be thinking like, wait, what do you mean? Like, that sounds crazy. How do people not know that? And that's probably the way I would have reacted as well until I met a lot of these people, who really don't have access to a lot of things. And so they don't have an email address. And anymore, it's like, even to apply for a job, you have to be online. You have to submit your resume online. You have to sign up with your email address. And not everyone even has that or knows how to do it. So that's actually a lot of what my partner does, is helping people navigate those types of things. So yeah, it's definitely a matter of privilege that I grew up not even, blinking at these types of things. Like, of course, everybody has an email address, and I've been using the internet since it happened, right? It was integrated into my schooling experience. And so I think being called a social justice warrior, or I don't so much identify with the warrior aspect, but being called a social justice witch or whatever, some people use that as an insult. And to me, it's not at all, because to me, it's a way of saying that I care about people other than myself, and that it sort of comes with a promise, which is that although I will mess up, I will try my best, and I will continue learning, and I will remember personal experiences that people have told me, such as the person who told me I can't go to the classes in my area or the gatherings in my area because they're not nearby a bus stop. I will remember that forever now, because that person shared that with me. And so that will forever be something that I now consider that I never did before. So to me, being a social justice witch or an eco-justice witch or whatever comes with a promise to always try to think about how things affect the people whose experiences are nothing like my own. That's what it means to me. It's not about being perfect. I really do try, but we can't beat ourselves up if we do mess up. We just have to, apologize when necessary, be open about the fact that we messed up when we do, and do better next time and never make the same mistake twice, and we're constantly learning. So something else that I always do is, you've heard me recommend, utilize your public library system as far as socioeconomic justice and access to information and financial accessibility. Utilize your public library system to find information. If you are an avid reader, if you are someone who reads, literacy is not a barrier for you, but maybe finances are. You can't buy all of the new books. Check your local public library system. See if you can borrow that book. All of these books that I've been reading this month, I got through my public library system, so I did not have to spend money because I do not have the budget to spend money on books this year. And if utilizing the library is the difference between reading all of Starhawk's books in 1 year versus reading nothing new all year, I'm going to use the library for sure. Secondhand books, buying your tools, your witchy tools or accessories or whatever from secondhand stores, thrift stores, antique stores, resale shops, whatever, or repurposing items that you already have. These are things that I am a huge proponent of because I myself do not have the finances to go and buy the fancy, shiny versions of things. If you have the financial resources and you have a desire to have those fancy, shiny things, awesome. Where I think there becomes a barrier to community is when people come into it thinking that they have to have the financial resources in order to be a witch. So whatever financial situation you have, whether you have a lot or you don't have any at all, and you want to work with repurposed items, secondhand items, whatever, I think it's just important that we remember whatever a person's situation is, you can be a witch, and that it's not about how much money you do or don't have. So that's a lot of where socioeconomic justice comes into play with my path as a pagan and a witch. And again, thank you to my partner for helping me wrap my head around it, because the term socioeconomic justice, even though these are things I talk about constantly and that I read about constantly, it still threw me for a loop that I was like, wait, what aspects of things that we do are socioeconomic justice as opposed to other types of justice, So access to information, all of these types of things. And that's nowhere near an exhaustive list. That's just a 35-minute ramble for you about some ways that these things affect my life in the way that, even if they don't affect my life directly, recognizing where those things are privileges of mine and remembering that not everyone has those same privileges, and trying to think up ways that I can help the people in our community who don't have the same privileges. And how can we be that person who volunteers to drive to the nearest bus stop to pick up the person who wants to come to the gathering, and they can get as far as this bus stop, but maybe it's a 20-minute walk for them. So maybe you volunteer to be that person to go pick them up at the bus stop and bring them the rest of the way. Or maybe you carpool with people. Maybe you a lot of classes now, and especially reclaiming in particular, and some events have sliding scales for admission for classes and things like that, so that those who can afford to pay the full price of the class to support that teacher, to support the transportation if you're having a teacher come in from out of town, or to support any materials that are needed for the class, the people who can afford to pay the full price do so that they are also funding, a little bit extra for those who are financially not capable of paying the full price for the class, but they'll pay what they can. It's almost like providing a scholarship. And some classes, workshops, some witch camps, which are in the reclaiming tradition, actually will set up for scholarships. So say, for example, a class cost is $15, and some people, if they are not able to pay $15, they can pay $5. And others, if you are able to pay $25, then you do so, and the extra $10 that was above the base cost of the class, that extra $10 might get cycled back around and considered the other $10 for that person who's in financial hardship at this time and could only afford $5. Those of us who have the ability to do so support the community by helping make things accessible for other people. Some things, of course, are offered for free. And so there's also a balance among teachers in trying to seek a balance between being financially accessible for people of different socioeconomic status and being fairly compensated for our own work and travel and time and experience, and so whatever we need. So yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to consider, whether you are attending things like this, whether you are a local community organizer, whether you are a teacher who travels to different communities and helps out, or just teaches locally in your own community. There are considerations for me about events that other people would like me to go to speak or teach, but I would have to pay quite a heavy fee and travel expenses in order to be there. So there's things that I have to say no to because of those types of limitations. And so recognizing that other people have those limitations too. Yeah, there's a lot. So thank you so much, Soul Seeker and Rebekah, for asking these questions. Again, I think that is just really great because it shows that these topics are becoming more widespread and they're not just being talked about by specific areas of the community that consider themselves social justice witches, social justice activists, environmental activists, whatever. And it's becoming something that more people are concerned about, which I think is a good thing, even if we're all only beginning to learn about it. Because actually something that I think I just read in this book last night, and I wrote it down, was awareness is the first step to insight, and insight is the first step to change. That was at the end of chapter 11, the chapter on the center, because that's what I just finished last night. Awareness is the first step to insight, and insight is the first step to change. So yeah, thanks so much for helping spread awareness. Thanks so much for watching this whole video, by the way. If you did so, give yourself a big round of applause and a pat on the back and a little treat, whatever that means to you. And I will see you all next week. Following that, it will be subs week, and then in December, we will have one full-time hosts week and one substitute hosts week, and then we are off for end of calendar year break until January. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you next time, and until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.